heavyweight champ.
Andy Ruiz is the heavyweight champion.
It is all over. Junior Dos Santos is the new UFC heavyweight champion of the world.
There are few things in the world that fascinates the public quite like the heavyweight. Throughout various forms of sport and entertainment, the bigger something or someone is, the more fascinated we are with it. It can be traced back to our days as hunter-gatherers. Size and power meant protection and dominance. We both respect and fear the presence of size. Our desires to defy and defeat that size has also been ingrained in our systems for nearly just as long. However, just as fascinated as we are of learning of someone challenging and overcoming something much larger than themselves, the concept of two behemoths toppling each other is just as alluring. It's difficult to really pinpoint what aspect of watching these types of competitions and conflicts intrigues us more. The intensity of watching something much larger and more powerful than ourselves showcase that strength, or the catharsis of watching something of equal power and size being humbled to the level of us mere mortals. And to that end, there is nothing that emphasizes the two sides of that coin quite like heavyweights in combat sports. In the sport of boxing, it's difficult for the common man to name many famous boxers that aren't heavyweights. Sure, there are the Floyd Mayweathers and Manny Pacquiaos of the sport that occasionally defy these norms, but the modern casual viewer of the sport is far more likely to know names like Mike Tyson, Muhammad Ali, George Foreman, and Tyson Fury, way more than names like Terence Crawford or Roberto Duran. And for a brief, joyous period in the sport of MMA, the same could be said of the heavyweight division. It's hard to pinpoint where exactly heavyweight in MMA reached its true peak. I guess it really depends on when your own individual interest in the sport was at its strongest. Some might say it was when Pride was at its most popular in the early to mid-2000s, an era fueled by lax drug testing, freak show fights, and a healthy mixture of styles, personalities, and body types. Some might say the Lesnar era, where the UFC was a land of giants, with fighters like Brock Lesnar, Shane Carwin, Frank Mir, and legends like Big Nog and Randy Couture were still relevant and elite in their talent. But to someone like me, heavyweight truly peaked between the years of 2011 and 2013. I know. Shocking, right? And one card in the spring of 2012 highlighted every aspect as to why this era was so enjoyable. As of 2026, heavyweight MMA is at an all-time low, with many hardcore fans dubiously referring to it as the Blob era. While many are quick to blame 2015's introduction of USADA as the reason for the decline of the modern heavyweight, there are many factors that aren't discussed as much. And while you'd like to believe it's because athletes are coming to terms with the reality that long-term exposure to steroids and PEDs leads to long-term health complications and consequences, unfortunately, it's for reasons that lead to even more troubling results. Weight cutting has only gotten more extreme as time has gone on, with fighters that compete in the welterweight division of 170 pounds walking around outside of camp upwards of 200 pounds plus. The heavyweight greats of old would likely compete at light heavyweight or even middleweight in some cases. The financial upsides of competing in combat sports, as opposed to other more mainstream sports for larger athletes, has also only diminished over time. And now with TKO attempting to take over boxing, this trend is likely going to only continue and expand. In other words, heavyweight has become less of a gold standard for combat sports and more of a last resort. And yes, increased emphasis on drug testing didn't help either. It can be argued that culturally, we are more self-conscious about our bodies and our appearance than ever as well. Our obsession with social media and influencers that highlight their bodies or physical fitness is also at an all-time high, painting a universally unrealistic picture of what a healthy body and mind actually resembles. Whereas things like vanity sizing and the body positivity movement, which can have their hearts in the right place, can unfortunately serve to increase insecurities and unhealthy fixations on one's personal appearance. And if you don't think the majority of athletes that deplete their bodies of nutrients and water to obtain a specific number on a scale have body issues, well, I don't know what to tell you. Back in 2012, it's not like these things didn't exist, but it was far less pronounced and less monetized. Junior Dos Santos was the king of the heavyweight division at the time, an absolutely shredded 6'4" Brazilian who possessed some of the best boxing the sport had seen up until that point. But unlike his fighting style and cold stare at the beginning of fights would suggest, Dos Santos was an absolute goofball who had a heart of gold, constantly being all smiles in interviews and media appearances, even helping his community by training impoverished children in his homeland. He had been set to make his first defense at UFC 146 in May of 2012 against Alistair Overeem. And if there was ever a yin to Junior Dos Santos' yang, it was 2012 Alistair Overeem. The Reem, Overeem, the Demolition Man. These were the nicknames given to the absolute force of nature that was Alistair Overeem in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Once a skinny light heavyweight who was little more than a gatekeeper in the Pride FC promotion, after a 1-4 slump between 2006 and 2007, Overeem spent the next couple years reinventing himself as a cocky, unrelenting, and terrifying force at heavyweight. He fought without any regard or care for his opponent's skill set or health, using knees, kicks, and meaty hooks to decimate his foes. Alistair also adapted the persona of a villain, presenting himself as an uncaring force of nature who knew he was going to end your night and that there was nothing you could do about it. He had also just retired MMA heavyweight's biggest star in Brock Lesnar in his previous fight, granting no mercy to a man who had just had over a foot of intestines removed from his body by repeatedly battering him in said weakened area. In his post-fight interview, he didn't even acknowledge the heavyweight champion in Dos Santos, who had been brought in the cage afterwards. The stage was set for a generational bout between two comic book physiqued men with a clear hero and a clear villain. But, well, even back then the MMA gods had different plans for us. Let's be honest with ourselves. There was no way Alistair Overeem was a clean athlete. If we are even more honest with ourselves, competing clean at the top level of any professional sport is more of an optimistic fantasy than reality. There are just some cases that are more obvious than others, and Overeem was certainly one of those cases. Alistair competed in fight promotions where drug testing was even more lax than a pre-USADA UFC. But immediately when Overeem came to the UFC, he seemed to be targeted specifically by the Nevada State Athletic Commission. He submitted 2 drug test samples deemed unacceptable for his UFC 141 fight against Brock Lesnar, but was granted a conditional license after meeting with the commission a little over 2 weeks before the event. The Reem was not so lucky for UFC 146. After a pre-fight press conference in March of 2012, the commission staged a surprise drug test of its main card athletes. And well, Alistair Overeem didn't have the chance to properly prepare this go-around. The Reem popped hot and had a 14-to-1 testosterone level, and no amount of horse meat would produce that kind of sauce. In many other pay-per-view card situations, this would have spelt disaster for the UFC to have such a high-profile fight fall out on such an important card for the company, especially given the tough year the UFC was already having in 2012. But in this specific situation, the UFC had more than enough room to shuffle things around because, you see, UFC 146 was unique in the best and most convenient way possible. Every fight on the main card was a heavyweight bout. If an all-heavyweight main card of a numbered event were to happen today, it would likely be the worst event in years, but as mentioned previously, 2012 was a spoil of heavyweight riches. There was even a heavyweight Grand Prix happening around this time in the second best MMA promotion in Strikeforce, where Daniel Cormier would complete an underdog story for the ages to win the tournament after beating Josh Barnett in May. Daniel Cormier's teammate was the aforementioned Cain Velasquez, the man Dos Santos had beaten to win the title in 2011, and Cain was competing on the UFC 146 card. However, it wouldn't be Cain competing against Dos Santos as a replacement, even though the story was there. The story of Cain Velasquez is more fascinating than his fight record would suggest at first glance. While his current legal troubles and failed stint in the WWE are the more recent events of note regarding the former heavyweight MMA king, Cain Velasquez should probably have been the greatest heavyweight of his era, and very likely of all time. Stylistically, Cain was compared to heavyweights like Fedor, Randy Couture, and even Brock Lesnar. His striking pressure, his draining cage control, and his wrestling top game were all wrapped into one tireless package as Cain had earned the nickname of Cardio Cain through his ability to last and not tire throughout long and grueling heavyweight affairs, which was nearly unheard of at the time. If Cain competed in modern MMA, he'd probably be able to comfortably make light heavyweight, as he would often weigh in the mid-230s to 240s range with a soft body type with plenty of water weight to spare. This made his ability to overpower men the size of Brock Lesnar, Ben Rothwell, and Czech Congo even more impressive. However, the kind of strain Cain put on his body during his training camps to compete with the behemoths he regularly toppled came with a price. After Cain exploded onto the scene by demolishing Brock Lesnar for the title in the fall of 2010, he lost over a year of competition time as he suffered a torn rotator cuff during said demolition. When he lost to Dos Santos in little over a year when he came back in November of 2011, it was revealed afterward that Cain had re-injured his rotator cuff a week before the fight took place. However, with the heavyweight title fight being the only fight to be showcased on the first ever Fox card, and having already lost a year of championship pay, Cain simply couldn't afford, in any definition of the word, to pull out of the fight with Junior Dos Santos. And while a much smaller man competing against the pre-USADA carnivores of the early 2010s would bring about injuries in the best of situations, footage of the types of strength and conditioning Cain was exposing his body to during these training camps was leaked online, and to say his form left a lot to be desired would be an understatement. While the sport had come a long way as of the 2010s, best practices for fitness management in MMA was still arguably in the dark ages. And with the advancements in things like extreme weight cutting and hiding staph infections, it can be argued that the sport continues to take 2 steps back while taking 1 step forward. Cain was set to make his return after losing his belt at UFC 146 against the man who, not too long ago, had been in Cain's position in Frank Mir. A generational heavyweight talent derailed by a devastating injury, Frank Mir had spent the better part of a decade climbing back up the heavyweight rankings only to fall back down numerous times. And now once again, he was set to face Cain Velasquez in a #1 contender fight after amassing a 3-fight winning streak. However, Mir wouldn't have to climb the monumentous task of defeating Cain to earn a title shot, as Mir was selected to replace Overeem against Junior Dos Santos, and Cain would have to take the frustration of not getting his title rematch against another heavyweight fighter that was scheduled to compete on the card, and Antonio Bigfoot Silva. But before we get to how these new main and co-main events played out, there was plenty of physical and metaphorical beef to get through on the main card first. There are plenty of interesting storylines that come out of the all-heavyweight main card of UFC 146. It was the pay-per-view main card debut of future heavyweight great Stipe Miocic. 7-foot-tall Stefan Skyscraper Struve won his fight in little over a minute, shockingly on the ground by pulling guard into an armbar. However, the third fight of the main card is where there was true intrigue, and showcased what, to this day, is still one of the biggest marketing missteps of the UFC when it came to one of its fighters. Big Country Roy Nelson could have absolutely been one of the biggest stars of the entire sport for a time. While he physically resembled many of the current 2026 Blob-era heavyweights, at his peak Roy Nelson was a knockout machine who also had a surprisingly effective ground game, and not just because of his size. In a heavyweight era fueled by steroids, aggressive tattoos, and male pattern baldness, Roy Nelson was fueled by food, an explosive right hand, and a long massive beard and mullet combo. And UFC president Dana White absolutely hated it. In a time where the UFC was still trying to find corporate mainstream respect, White found everything about Roy Nelson to be wrong. He would routinely badmouth his unkempt appearance and body shame his physique, which led to many a disagreement between the two. Some felt it started when Nelson won one of the most watched seasons of The Ultimate Fighter by defeating much more traditionally marketable competitors in internet sensation Kimbo Slice and Brendan Schaub. However, there was no question these criticisms had the opposite effect, as Roy Nelson gained the love of the one group Dana White couldn't deny at the time, the fans. While 2026 Dana White is completely checked out and makes fights and business decisions that he thinks will generate the most sponsorship revenue and casual interest regardless of what the fans think, in 2012 Dana White was largely beholden to what the fans wanted, as pay-per-views and live gates still made the majority of their income. And fans absolutely loved Roy Nelson. The man who Roy Nelson fought at UFC 146 was originally supposed to be the aforementioned Antonio Bigfoot Silva, but the main event shakeup led to Big Country fighting Dave Herman instead. Herman was the type of fighter that Dana White would have promoted the hell out of back in the day. Tall, shredded, and exciting to watch, but his talent just wasn't up to par, and Nelson absolutely obliterated Herman in little under a minute, earning Nelson Knockout of the Night honors. The truly frustrating trend about Nelson's career is that he could never quite win the big one. In between ferocious knockouts of lesser or aging opponents, Nelson would lose to names like Junior Dos Santos, Frank Mir, Fabricio Verdum, and Daniel Cormier. This essentially made Nelson a gatekeeper in the division. And since Dana White refused to promote him as the hardcore favorite that he was, when Nelson started to lose some pep in his step and speed in his punches, he began to become little more than an afterthought as his losses began to pile up. At the time of Roy Nelson's prime, the UFC had sponsorship deals with brands like Bud Light, Harley-Davidson, and Burger King. How many millions of dollars in sponsorship revenue did the UFC leave on the table not utilizing Big Country as a promotional figurehead of these brands? And equally, how many millions of dollars aren't in a now nearly 50-year-old Roy Nelson's bank account due to the UFC refusing to acknowledge what they had in Big Country? We will likely never truly know, but after Nelson's KO of Herman, the men the UFC wanted to push were up next in the main and co-main events, and Cain Velasquez was about to put a generational beating that made even the most hardcore fans forget about the knockout Nelson had just delivered. In 2003, Quentin Tarantino released the first part of his nearly 5-hour epic, Kill Bill. The movie had an extended action sequence that was so cartoonishly violent it was apparently given the rating of NC-17 by the MPAA. And in a stylistic choice to bypass this rating, Tarantino desaturated the scene into black and white. Pictures and videos of Cain Velasquez versus Antonio Bigfoot Silva would likely have to have the same effect done to them to avoid the same fate. But this wasn't a movie. This was real life. If Cain's 1-minute loss to Dos Santos the previous year had taken the wind out of Cain's sails, this fight turned those sails into a rocket ship. Cain's mauling of Bigfoot to this day is held in the same violence pantheon of fights like Robbie Lawler versus Rory McDonald II and BJ Penn versus Joe Stevenson for their absolute primal fury and gallons of red that was spilt. And while this fight secured Cain's position as the next contender for the title, as for Bigfoot, his career would unfortunately endure many more violent ends going forward. Surprisingly, Bigfoot would bounce back from this setback and earn a title shot to rematch Cain after he defeated an injured Travis Brown and upset a returning and way less defined Alistair Overeem in 2013. He was once again quickly dispatched in that rematch by Cain in a less violent and more technical fashion, similarly to how Cain's teammate Daniel Cormier had defeated Bigfoot 2 years prior in 2011. Bigfoot would then go on to have another incredibly violent and crimson fight against Mark Hunt, in which the one time a fight was declared a draw was the most satisfying outcome possible. But the fight would be sullied by a failed drug test on Silva's part for elevated testosterone. However, Bigfoot was one of the few cases where the usage of PEDs was legitimately necessary, as he, unsurprisingly, suffered from the condition of gigantism, which caused hormone imbalances in his body and hindered both his personal and professional lives. Bad faith actors like Vitor Belfort and Chael Sonnen abusing TRT, or testosterone replacement therapy, had stigmatized the practice, and fighters with legit conditions like Bigfoot Silva were the ones to suffer the most from the banning of this practice. This failed drug test against Mark Hunt not only cost Bigfoot 9 months of his career while in his prime, but he also lost at least $50,000 in bonus money as well. His body had taken an incredible amount of punishment over the last 2 years, and the only thing Bigfoot had gotten out of it was the label of a drug cheat. Aside from one lone victory in 2015, Bigfoot would know nothing but loss for the remainder of a professional career that went on long past its expiration date, many ending in violent knockouts. While Bigfoot had experienced some of the highest possible feelings of elation defeating legends like Fedor and Overeem during his professional career, it ended being knocked out by nondescript fighters in vague European fight promotions, forcing us all to face the realities of what being someone that takes brain damage for a living truly looks like once the brightest lights stop shining on you. Someone who the lights shone brightest on that night in May of 2012 at UFC 146, however, was Junior Dos Santos. Junior Dos Santos defeated Frank Mir with relative ease in the main event of the night. His boxing pressure was simply too much for the now aging veteran. Cigano, as he was called, was riding high in 2012. He became sponsored by the Brazilian division of Nike. He was now a reigning and defending champion, and his charitable work with impoverished Brazilian communities made him a beloved figure of the sport and a gentle giant to the fan base. Even with Cain's war crime committed against Bigfoot, and the circumstances of their first fight now public knowledge, JDS was still favored to win his rematch against Cain at the end of 2012. It turned out to be an absolute disaster for the Brazilian. A healthy Cain Velasquez absolutely battered Junior Dos Santos to a lopsided unanimous decision win to regain his title. The two would close out their trilogy in the fall of 2013, with Cain again absolutely throttling JDS to a late finish in the 5th round. And while the trilogy produced more drama than most MMA rivalries, especially at heavyweight, neither man was ever the same after. Cain Velasquez would only fight 3 more times after defeating JDS the second time, going 1-2. The damage his body had taken from the much larger men and from his questionable training practices had taken their toll. Meanwhile, Junior Dos Santos would go on to fight 11 more times in the UFC, even earning another title shot. But he was never truly the same killer after the 2 beatings from Cain. He even lost his eventual fight with Alistair Overeem, a fight that was a shadow of what it could have been when it was originally booked. Dos Santos was timid and reserved in the bout, and Overeem was a physical shadow of what he was back in his heyday. Most MMA fans have forgotten the 2 of them even fought each other. Dos Santos eventually left the UFC at the end of 2020, departing on a 4-fight losing streak, where he was finished in each fight. Earlier that year, Cain Velasquez had been released by the WWE during their 2020 COVID protocol layoffs. 2020 continues to be the year you find out more awful things happened within it. No fighter from the main card of UFC 146 fights anymore. Stefan Struve is now successfully doing desk work and reporting for the sport he competed in. His opponent from that night, well, has seen better days. Stipe Miocic went on to become one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. However, his opponent that night unfortunately passed away due to cardiac arrest. Roy Nelson's MMA career would eventually fade from the public's eye as well, officially ending in 2023 after amassing a record of 24 wins with 20 losses, barely going over 500. We've already covered the unfortunate tale of Bigfoot's career. Frank Mir would go 3-7 in his last 10 fights after losing to Dos Santos, but would strangely enough end his career on a win against Roy Nelson within Bellator in 2019. The current status of heavyweight combat sports is a dark age of scattered and aging talent. The best heavyweight boxer is Alexander Usyk, and he's a natural cruiserweight. There is no true consensus #1 MMA heavyweight, and there arguably hasn't been one since Francis Ngannou left the UFC, with a baffling and frustrating championship reign of heavyweight John Jones, who was essentially just an older version of light heavyweight John Jones with a gut, and an equally but differently frustrating title reign of Tom Aspinall as well. The current state of heavyweight can be summarized by the career of its arguably most popular fighter, Derrick Lewis. Sometimes it's exciting, oftentimes it's silly, and sometimes it just seems like it doesn't care. However, the fascination is still ever present, and even in its wildly diminished state, there's always still a chance for its magic to happen once again. And UFC 146 was a card that still to this day can remind us all of what magic the wrath of these titans can produce.